Welcome, dear horror writer. Tonight the candles burn low, the raging storm outside claws at the windows, and this oppressive old house seems as if it's caged us in its lungs. With all of that, it feels like the perfect time to descend into one of my all-time favorite subgenres, Gothic horror. I adore it so much that I even wrote my university thesis on it, so I might have gone a little bit overboard on this one, but I hope you guys don't mind. So steady your nerves, light your lantern, and follow me into the corridors where secrets linger and shadows never sleep. Welcome to Gothic horror. So what is Gothic horror? Gothic horror is a horror subgenre that blends the eerie with the emotional and the supernatural with the psychological. And it's this slow, creeping sense of dread that hangs over everything. Gothic horror has the kind of stories where you feel like the characters and maybe even you are being pulled towards something inevitable and there's no escaping it. Now, what makes Gothic horror so fascinating is contrast. Beauty and decay are always side by side. Love and fear twist together. The characters are usually stuck in this push and pull of where part of them wants to run away, but the other part of them can't help being drawn deeper into the doom and madness. Now, the biggest difference between Gothic horror and a lot of other horror subgenres is that it isn't about survival in the straightforward sense that we find a monster, survive its wrath, kill it, and then prevail, and we all live happily ever after. Because here, you're not asking, will they make it out alive? But instead, you're asking, what horrible truth are they going to uncover? And what will it cost them in return for doing so? When you step into the world of a Gothic horror story, you're stepping into a world where every shadow has the possibility of hiding something, where every locked door has a secret festering behind it, and where no one gets out unchanged. Here, we're not just exploring the darkness around us, but we're also exploring the darkness within us, and that's why it holds us so deeply. So, when we talk about Gothic horror, we're talking about one of the oldest and most enduring traditions in horror storytelling. Gothic horror is a shadow that's stretched across centuries, changing with the world but never truly disappearing. So, let's walk through the timeline from its strange birth in the 18th century, through its bloody rebirths in the Victorian age, and into the ways it still haunts us today. So it all begins in 1764 with Horace Walpole's The Castle of Otranto. This strange little novel was unlike anything readers had ever seen before. Instead of polite manners and rational tales, Walpole gave the world a story full of haunted castles, secret passages, family curses, and supernatural omens. One of the most interesting things about The Castle of Otranto is the way that Walpole played with the boundary between reality and fiction. When the novel was first published, he didn't even put his name on it. Instead, he posted as William Marshall Gent, the supposed translator of a much older text. In the preface, this fictional Marshall claims that he discovered a 1529 copy of Otranto in its original Italian, tucked away in the library in northern England. He even insists that the manuscript was set during the darkest ages of Christianity, though, oddly enough, the language was far too polished to be considered barbaric. By framing his story this way, Walpole made it feel like a genuine relic of the past rather than a brand new piece of fiction. Now, for readers in the 18th century who were used to moral tales and classical restraints of modern literature, this sudden rush of giant helmets crushing noblemen, portraits walking out of their frames, and looming family doom was electrifying. It was the beginning of something new, a literature of shadows, where the past pressed down on the present and even the walls of your home could betray and destroy you. And people were obsessed. Very quickly, writers like Clara Reeve and Radcliffe picked up the torch and carried it forward. Reeves, is the old English baron, tried to refine Walpole's wild supernatural excess into something more believable, while Radcliffe elevated the Gothic into art. Radcliffe especially shaped the genre by blending terror with beauty and landscapes with psychology. In novels like The Mysteries of Udolpho, you'll find spanned brooding castles, storm-swept mountains, mysterious strangers, and heroines caught between awe and dread. She perfected the explained supernatural, where seemingly ghostly events often had rational causes, but the emotional effect lingered long after the reveal. Then in 1796 came Matthew Lewis's scandalous The Monk, which shook up the Gothic world. Because where Radcliffe would beat around the bush or suggest about certain topics, Lewis decided not to censor those things and instead gave readers everything in lurid detail. From blood to lust to demons, corruption, incest, and even some damnation. The novel was shocking to a lot of people who read it, and not just because of its depictions of violence and sexuality, but also because its protagonist, Ambrosio the monk, was supposed to embody virtue and holiness because the man's a monk. But instead, Lewis dragged him into temptation, obsession, and moral collapse, which horrified a society that was steeped in Christian values. The idea that a man of God could be seduced by Satan, commit grisly acts, and fall into damnation was nothing short of scandalous. Critics called the novel obscene and blasphemous, but all that outrage and controversy proved just to boost its fame, because it's now considered one of the most popular and influential Gothic tales of its time. But it's this tension between Radcliffe's subtle terror and Lewis's lurid sensationalism that would shape Gothic horror forever. On one side, you had the refined atmospheric dread of shadows, whispers, and suggestion, and on the other hand, the shocking spectacle of blood, sex, and the diabolical. And it's in that uneasy space between suggestion and excess that Gothic horror truly found its voice. Now, at the same time, Europe was knee-deep in the Romantic movement, which was an era where poets, painters, and composers turned away from rigid rationalism and instead chased raw emotion, wild landscapes, and the sublime, that overwhelming mix of awe and terror in the face of nature's power. And because of that, it's safe to say that the Gothic subgenre rippled perfectly in its current. Imagine stormy skies over crumbling abbeys, moonlight pouring across jagged mountain cliffs, or endless moors. Here we were seeing mundane settings become emotional landscapes that were reflecting the storms inside the human soul. In this world, ruins became symbols of time's cruelty. Nature became both a sanctuary and a menace, and characters mirrored the wildness of their settings. The Gothic novel became the perfect vessel for exploring obsession, madness, forbidden desires, and the uncanny forces lurking just beyond reason. It was terror cloaked in beauty, and for readers hungry for this kind of intensity, it was irresistible. Now, by the 1800s, the Gothic genre was reborn and made into something even more darker than it already was before, because now we saw the genre being reshaped by the anxieties of a rapidly changing world. Industrialization was filling cities with smoke and machines, science was pushing the boundaries of what people thought possible, and empires were expanding while bringing new fears to the unknown. Gothic horror during this period wasn't just about castles and curses anymore, but it became a mirror for the fears of progress, showing how every leap forward carried its own shadow. Mary Shelley gave us Frankenstein in 1818, a story about ambition, science, and the horror of creation itself. She showed the Gothic was no longer just about haunted castles, but it also explored humanity's own hubris. Then came Edgar Allan Poe, whose stories were steeped in madness, paranoia, and premature death, turning Gothic horror inwards so that the true haunted house became the human mind. Later, Bram Stoker's Dracula, published in 1897, combined disease, sexuality, religion, and xenophobia to create one of the most enduring monsters in literature. While Sheridan Le Faun's Carmilla had already introduced the vampire as forbidden desire, Stoker transformed the vampire into an invasive force, a contagion, and the immortal aristocrat who refuses to die. The Victorian Gothic gave us the monsters that continue to shape our fears to this day. But the Gothic didn't remain locked away in Europe. In America, it took on a new shape in the South, evolving into what we know now as Southern Gothic. The grand plantations, once symbols of wealth and power, became crumbling estates haunted by secrets, grotesque characters, and generations of corruption. Here, the horror was social, exposing the rot beneath traditions, the violence of history, and the decay of moral order. And we can look to readers like William Faulkner and Flannery O'Connor who mastered this form. But by the mid-20th century, it was Shirley Jackson who was carrying the torch. Her contributions of The Haunting of Hill House and We Always Lived in the Castle brought Gothic horror back to its core. Houses that seemed alive, families that suffocate, and characters who can never escape their past. And as we grow closer to modern times, Gothic horror once again transformed. Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca gave us modern Gothic romance. Angela Carter twisted fairy tales into dark, sensual Gothic nightmares in The Bloody Chamber. And Anne Rice revived the vampire as decadent and tragic with Interview with the Vampire. And today, the Gothic is still alive and thriving, thank goodness. Guillermo del Toro paints the Gothic colors with crimson peak, filling the scenes with decaying mansions, doomed love, and the weight of history. And then there's Silvia Moreno Garcia's Mexican Gothic, which is one of my all-time faves, which takes the classic haunted house and plants it into the hills of Mexico and layers and themes of colonialism, race, and generational trauma. It shows how the Gothic continues to evolve by reshaping its shadows to reflect the fears of new faces and new times. So after all that, I think you can tell that the big lesson here is that Gothic horror adapts. Every era has its ruins, its shadows, and its secrets just waiting to be brought to life. The 18th century had castles and family curses. The Victorians had science and repression. And today we have colonial legacies, trauma, and environmental dread. Essentially, Gothic horror finds what society fears most and then wraps it into beauty and decay. Alright, now enough of me blathering about history, let's dive into the core concepts. At the very heart of Gothic horror are the ideas that have stayed the same for centuries. You'll see them coming back again and again because they speak to what it means to be human, to be trapped, and to be haunted. So let's walk through the beating heart of the Gothic subgenre. First, we have decay and ruins. Gothic horror thrives on ruins because ruins act as symbols of time's cruelty. A crumbling castle on a cliff, a mansion lined with cobwebs and peeling wallpaper, or a monastery left hollow and broken, they all tell us the same story, that the past is never gone. Once grand places that held immense extravagance now lay in rot, and with them, so do the families, empires, and legacies that are tied to them. Ruins remind us that power doesn't last, beauty doesn't endure, and that history refuses to stay buried. In the Gothic imagination, the very walls remember, and they rarely ever forgive. Now let's move into isolation. So isolation is one of Gothic horror's most strongest narrative engines because Gothic horror doesn't take place in big crowded cities or bustling marketplaces, but instead it unfolds in manor houses on storm-swept moors, in lonely covenants high in the mountains, or in labyrinthine estates where there's no means of ever escaping. And the reason why Gothic horror likes to isolate is because it physically traps characters by cutting them off from help and often a lot of times the outside world. But it also mirrors their inner lives, which amplifies their psychological loneliness. It's no coincidence that so many Gothic heroes and heroines feel like outsiders because this subgenre feeds on the echo of being misunderstood and the fear that no one will ever truly know you or believe you. Next, we have madness and obsession. So when it comes to madness in Gothic horror, it rarely ever comes out of nowhere, but rather it's usually given by them being overtaken by some kind of obsession. Like the protagonist sees something that's deemed forbidden, they desire something or someone dangerous, or they uncover a secret that they can't ignore or let go of. The fixation on whatever it is deepens, their sleep and reason unravel, and soon their mind starts spiraling into ruin. But in Gothic stories, unlike psychological horror where the madness is all in their head, here instead we see it bleeding through into their environment, seeping into the house, the landscape, and the very air itself, until the entire world feels tainted by their madness. Think of it like the obsession is a slow poison that drives Gothic horror forward, and madness is the inevitable collapse. Now we have duality, which is a theme that the Gothic subgenre has always been fascinated with. This is all about showing the split within the self, the light and the dark, the noble and the corrupt, the civilized and the monstrous. The idea that good and evil aren't two separate forces, but rather they're bound together inside a single person. Stories like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and The Picture of Dorian Gray show off this doubleness perfectly, by showing us characters who wear civility on the outside while hiding the rot beneath their surface. And here, the horror comes from realizing that the real monster isn't out there lurking in the shadows, but rather from the recognition that the villain is, in some way, a reflection of the hero. Now, if there's one thing that the Gothic subgenre likes to do is constantly warn us that certain doors shouldn't be opened because something forbidden and long buried lies in wait on the other side of it. From Frankenstein's experiments with life and death to occult rituals hidden in dusty libraries, forbidden knowledge is both intoxicating and destructive. It represents the hunger to know more, to seize power, to push past limits of reason, and of course the ruin that inevitably follows. Similar to cosmic horror, in Gothic horror, the pursuit of truth rarely ends in triumph, but rather it ends in corruption, death, or the unraveling of the mind. Now, from its earliest days, the Gothic subgenre has been a mirror for gender roles and oppression. Just think of it. The subgenre is full of women being locked in towers, being gaslit by men, or being forced into marriages that they can't escape from. And the men, meanwhile, wield authority and often abuse it. And we can see this take shape in characters such as tyrannical fathers, predatory aristocrats, or hypocritical priests. But Gothic horror also plants seeds of rebellion with the women who resist, the heroine who uncovers the forbidden truth, and the figure who finds her voice in a house designed to silence her. These power struggles are central to the Gothic and deeply resonate even today. Now, no one in a Gothic story is free from some kind of guilt. Sometimes it's a collective guilt, like a family bloodline is cursed by the sins of its ancestors. Sometimes it's a personal guilt, like a betrayal, lust, cowardice, or a crime that's never been confessed. And of course, like all guilt, it festers, and refusing to stay hidden until it consumes every part of the present. And being redeemed of all this guilt, if it ever even comes at all, is rare and costly. And more often than not, guilt only leads to more ruin, because in Gothic horror, the past always comes back no matter how deep you bury it, and it always demands a price. And lastly, what would Gothic horror be without the supernatural and the uncanny? Because at the core of Gothic horror lies the tantalizing question of, is the horror real, or is it all just imagined? Is the house really haunted, or is it just a character slowly losing their mind? Is the vampire a genuine predator, or is it just a metaphor for hidden desire? The Gothic subgenre thrives on this ambiguity. Ghosts, split personalities, hallucinations, and doppelgangers all blur the line between reality and nightmare and leave both the character and the reader unsure of what's really going on until the big reveal. And that uncertainty is the essence of the uncanny and what makes Gothic horror linger long after it's been put down. If there's one thing that Gothic horror can't live without, it's atmosphere. And the setting, well, yes, it's where your horror is going to take place, but in many ways, in Gothic horror, your setting is the story itself. Because a Gothic setting breathes, remembers, and pushes back against the characters who move throughout it. You can think of it as if it's another character in your cast, one that shapes the mood and drives the tension just as much as anyone haunting your pages. So let's break down the key elements that make a Gothic setting. First, let's start with haunted castles and mansions because what would Gothic horror be without them? So, the Gothic house is more than just stone walls, velvet curtains, and creaking staircases, but it carries memory, history, and trauma all within it. Every hallway, every locked door, every portrait on the wall says something about the people who built it and those who now live or lived inside of it. So when you write a Gothic house, don't just describe what we see and leave it at that, but really describe how it feels to walk through the house. Is the silence too heavy? Do the shadows stretch as if they're trying to swallow you whole? Do the locked rooms seem to be holding their breath, waiting to exhale? These details invite the reader to feel like the building is alive and is watching the characters. Now let's step outside the mansion and wander into the wider Gothic landscape. That's the moors, the ruins, and the crypts. In Gothic horror, the land usually bears the same kind of weight as the house does. It's heavy, brooding, and alive with meaning. And we'll usually find that these landscapes are bleak, windswept, and just overall unsettling because it's reflecting the inner turmoil of the characters who roam them. These places deepen the story's emotional atmosphere because when a character feels trapped, lost, or haunted, that makes the land around them echo it back like a dark mirror, turning their despair into something vast and inescapable. Now, seeing that we're in that area, let's talk about the weather. In Gothic horror, the weather is where we set the mood. A storm isn't only thunder and rain, but a sign that a conflict is beginning to brew. Fog in all of its eerie glory is where we hide and blur the line between what's real and what's imagined. And the moonlight is there to illuminate what should have stayed hidden and buried away. So what you want to do here is treat the weather like a part of your atmosphere toolkit. Let it shift with a story where we see it being foreboding one moment and then suffocating the next, which in return will give the reader the feeling that even the sky is in on the horror. Now we have hidden spaces, and every Gothic story makes very good use of them. Think of the locked attic, the shadowy basement, the secret passage in the master bedroom. And while yes, this can be narrative devices for plot twists, but what these really are symbols. The attic can represent things that have been lost or forgotten. The basement can point to what's been buried, and the locked room can represent things that have been repressed or hidden. So if you decide to use hidden spaces in your story, think about what they mean for your characters, because a character obsessed with the past could find themselves drawn to a library, while someone hiding secrets might avoid the attic or even make it off limits because it has proof of their family's shame or guilt. And finally, we have decay, which is one of the most defining aspects of the Gothic aesthetic. In this world, grandeur never lasts. A mansion might stand proudly on top of a hill, but up close, its walls could be cracking, its halls damp and starting to smell of rot, its beauty slowly crumbling. Even when the maids scrub and polish every day, the past still manages to seep through the plaster. But decay isn't just about what we see in front of us, it's also symbolic. Every collapsing archway, moth-eaten curtain, or chair worn to splinters reminds us that the present rests on the fragile foundations. Once there may have been glory, wealth, or innocence, but over time, trauma and long-buried sins have left their mark. So the big takeaway here with all of this is to treat your setting as if it were alive. Give it moods, give it desires, and let it interact with your characters. Now, what would Gothic horror be without its protagonist? But rather than being the pure or heroic one that we're so used to seeing, Gothic horror finds our main haunt in a form that's cracked, complicated, and often weighed down by the very darkness the character is trying to resist. Here, we're not following dragon slayers, our fearless heroes, but we're following people who are haunted, flawed, and deeply human. So let's look at the main archetypes you'll come across and how you can write them for your story. First, we have the outsider or the isolated hero, and as its title suggests, this is the character who doesn't fit in. This means that they could be an orphan, someone who's been exiled, or just someone who doesn't belong in the society that's around them. All in all, they're cut off, and that lack of connection makes them vulnerable. We can look at Victor Frankenstein, whose ambition isolates him, or Heathcliff in Wuthering Heights, whose outsider status fuels his obsession and rage. And these characters aren't just meant to stand alone and have a me against society attitude, but they're usually defined by a flaw that deepens their isolation, like pride, guilt, or obsession. So if you write an outsider, then let their loneliness echo in the world around them. A crumbling ruin, a locked room, or a family secret that no one wants to unearth can all serve as external mirrors for that inner alienation. Now we have the Byronic hero, which is probably the most recognizable Gothic archetype that there is. This is the brooding, magnetic, self-destructive type that's neither a straightforward villain or a traditional hero, but instead they nestle themselves in that gray area where danger and allure blur together. Characters like Rochester and Jane Eyre, Heathcliff, and even Dracula all carry that blend of charisma and cruelty, and they all manage to draw people in even as they destroy themselves. If you're going to write a Byronic hero, then lean into that contradiction that I just mentioned. Give them intelligence but also recklessness, or passion alongside despair. They should feel like someone the reader wants to see redeemed, even when deep down we know that redemption isn't coming for them whatsoever. Now there's the innocent hero, and this is the wide-eyed character who steps into the Gothic world without a clue in the world about what they're going to face. This archetype usually represents purity, goodness, or moral clarity. Well, at least at first, before the reality comes tumbling down on them. Jonathan Harker in Dracula and Jane Eyre are both great examples of the innocent hero because they both enter situations where they don't fully understand and become the lens through which we feel the dread of discovering all of the hidden corruption. And the innocent hero works well because they're the most relatable to the readers, because readers can see themselves in that first encounter they have with the unknown. But this is Gothic horror, so that innocence rarely ever lasts. Sooner or later, the protagonist has to decide what they're willing to lose, be it either their mortality, safety, or even sanity, in order to survive. Then there's the reluctant hero, and the reluctant hero is usually just a plain, ordinary person who gets pulled into extraordinary horror. And at first, we see them not wanting to get involved, hence why they're reluctant. They resist the pull, deny things, and maybe even try to run away, but the story corners them in a room with no doors or windows, and eventually they're forced to face what terrifies them. Eleanor Vance in The Haunting of Hill House is a classic example of the reluctant hero because she doesn't seek out horror, but Hill House instead binds itself to her. The best way to think about a reluctant hero is that their journey should feel inevitable because the horror chooses them. So the defining trait for all Gothic protagonists is that they're flawed, haunted, and they never remain untouched by the setting or the story's themes. And their choices should never be easy. Their decisions should carry weight like betrayal, sacrifice, or a truth so heavy it might just break them. And rarely do these characters walk away with happy endings. More often, they're just left with scars, madness, or tragedy. And that's what makes them unforgettable. Gothic protagonists stick with us because they're not shining examples of light, but they're people who step into darkness and are forever changed by it. Now, I usually don't talk about antagonists of the subgenres, but with Gothic horror, the antagonist is just as important as the protagonist because they're more often than not their shadow. They're the pressure that drives the story forward, the force that won't let the hero rest. And unlike in other subgenres where the antagonist doesn't always take on a human form, but in Gothic tales, the enemy can just as easily be a ghost, a house, or even the protagonist's own mind. So let's break them down. First, there's the supernatural antagonists, which are the ghosts, vampires, demons, and cursed spirits, which are all staples of Gothic horror. But what makes them work so well isn't just their supernatural presence, but the meaning behind them. A ghost is rarely just a restless soul, but they can embody memory loss or unfinished guilt. A vampire isn't just a bloodsucker predator, but carries the weight of taboo, desire, and forbidden intimacy. And demons, a lot of times, reflect the sin or temptation that Protagonist has tried to bury. So, the key here in all of this is that the supernatural force should always tie back to the story's themes. It haunts for a reason and it tempts because there's always a weakness waiting to be exposed. Now, few archetypes loom as large in the Gothic world as the tyrant. The cruel patriarch, the demurring lord, the husband who controls and silences his wife and those around him. These figures represent the abuse of power, and their menace is both physical and psychological. So when you write this kind of antagonist, make their presence inescapable. Even when they're not on the page, their influence should be felt everywhere. Their rules, their watchful eyes boring down from their portrait, and their ability to crush freedom should hang over every scene. Now, sometimes the scariest enemy can be the one rattling inside the protagonist's skull. Madness, guilt, obsession can all consume a character just as thoroughly as any ghost can. Heck, even a ghost could just be all in their head. Edgar Allan Poe captured this perfectly in The Telltale Heart, where the monster isn't an external being, but rather the character's own guilt, conscience, given sound. And as a writer, you can do this by blurring the line between the outer and the inner worlds. Is the haunting real or a product of trauma? Is the monster lurking outside or does it live within the character's own mind? When the reader can't tell, you've tapped into Gothic horror in its most unsettling form. Then we have the anti-hero and the good old Gothic villain. These figures usually blur the line between terror and allure by embodying a dangerous charm that makes them irresistible to the protagonist. Think of Dracula's hypnotic pull, Dorian Gray's intoxicating beauty, or the many brooding bionic heroes who dominate Gothic literature. And what makes them work so well is that they entice us. They pull both characters and the reader in closer, tempting them with elegance, charisma, and the promises of forbidden pleasure, even as corruption festers beneath the surface. The horror in all of this lies in that attraction, in the realization that what fascinates and attracts us might also be slowly destroying us in the process. Now, on one last note before we wrap up this section, I think it's important to understand why Gothic antagonists work differently from villains in other horror subgenres. Because in most stories, once the monster is slain or the villain is defeated, the narrative finds a resolution. But with Gothic horror, rarely are the antagonists that easy to get rid of, because they're not just characters but embodiments of history, memory, and fate itself. And their power lies in their connection to the past, to family curses, an ancient sin, or a collective trauma that refuses to stay buried. This is why even when the demon is exorcised, the vampire is staked, or the corrupt patriarch is brought to ruin, their presence still lingers. They remain as shadows in the walls, echoes in the silence, or stains on the bloodline. Gothic horror thrives on this persistence because it reflects the central theme of this subgenre that, again, is that the past can't easily be destroyed, but rather it haunts, shaping the present and threatening to consume the future every chance it gets. Gothic horror doesn't unfold like other types of horror. Here, it's all about the slow unraveling. The story follows a structure that winds itself tighter and tighter, dragging the characters into fates that feel both inevitable and inescapable. And the dread in all of this comes from that inevitability and watching the spiral close in until there's no way out. So here are the keys to shaping that descent. So the first key is foreshadowing. From the very first pages, Gothic stories drop hints of what's going to come, like a prophetic dream, a warning from a stranger, or a portrait whose eyes seem to follow you whenever you walk by. All of these are the early ripples of dread, but make sure that you don't use foreshadowing too much because you don't want the reader piecing everything together before you've even got to your big reveal. Think of it like this, that the reader shouldn't know what's coming, but but only that something is waiting for them. Now, at the center of almost every Gothic story is a core mystery. It might be a lost inheritance, a family secret, a forbidden romance, or a death no one wants to talk about. Essentially, this core mystery is the thread that pulls the protagonist deeper into the house, the ruins, and/or the past. And the important part to remember is that the mystery should always connect the protagonist's personal stakes to their history, their desires, or their future. Because yes, they're trying to solve this plaguing puzzle, but they're also uncovering something that matters to them directly. Now, the third key is nestled narratives. So this is where things like diaries, letters, or stories within stories come into play, because these are all Gothic storytelling techniques. They create layers of perspective and with them a sense of uncertainty, because they make us ask, are we really reading the truth, or is it just someone's distorted version of the truth? And you can use these devices as ways to distance the reader just enough to make them question reality, with every new perspective adding another veil and another opportunity for them to doubt. Now, when it comes to revealing information, in Gothic stories, secrets don't just spill out all at once like psychobabble, but rather they reveal themselves gradually, like wallpaper that's slowly curling off of damp walls. Each new revelation that you introduce is smaller than the last one, but they're also going to be more disturbing, which in return leads the reader closer to the core truth. And also structure your reveals carefully so that each one builds dread, so that they narrow the available options and tighten the trap around the protagonist. Now, as the story unfolds, like any other subgenre, the danger is going to intensify. The villain's grip tightens, the haunting grows more insistent, the house becomes harder to escape. Each step of this escalation should feel heavier and more suffocating than the last, until the protagonist is cornered and can't escape. And when the protagonist that we find in this unfortunate situation finally comes to facing the source of their torment, that's where our climax is going to come in. Now, this doesn't always mean that a physical fight is going to take place, because sometimes their battle is internal, a moment where guilt, madness, or trauma rise to the surface and explode. Other times, it's the revelation that the haunting was within themselves all along. Alright, now that we've unpacked all of that, let's get into how to make it into an actual story. Now, like I said earlier, Gothic horror is written as a descent, like a spiral staircase winding downward into dread and despair. And that journey usually unfolds in 6 stages. So I'm going to walk you through each stage. So let's go. So stage 1 is the arrival and awe. Every Gothic horror story begins with an arrival. A character comes to a new, unsettling place that could be a castle, a monastery, a remote village, or a decaying mansion. And at first, it's not outrightly creepy or terrifying. In fact, there's usually an air of romance and wonder. We see the protagonist drawn in by its beauty, grandeur, or mystery. But as you know, that beauty is only on the outside, because on the inside, the hallways echo in the night. The portraits give you some serious side-eye, or its inhabitants are a strange bunch that are governed by even stranger rules and habits. Essentially, what you're trying to do from the very beginning is to tell the reader that something is not right here. Stage 2 is isolation and entrapment. Once the awe that the protagonist first had fades away, they now realize that they're trapped in wherever it is that they find themselves. Sometimes this entrapment can be physical, like a storm cutting them off. The gates are locked with no keys in sight, or the corridor seems to be endless. Other times, the entrapment can be social, because the protagonist is the outsider or the newcomer who doesn't belong there, and everyone is making damn sure that they know about it. And a lot of times, an entrapment that we see tied into those two is an emotional entrapment, where the protagonist is tied to a forbidden love, bound by family duty, or silenced by someone in power. Essentially, this stage is all about claustrophobia, and what you're trying to do is to shrink the world around your protagonist until there's nowhere to run. The house becomes a prison, and even if they did leave, where would they go? Now, stage 3 is where the unraveling is going to begin. Gothic horror loves some good old secrets, and this is where your protagonist is going to start peeling them back. This is when they find the locked rooms, the hidden journals, the portraits of dead relatives. They stumble on ruins, crypts, and whispered stories of curses and crimes. What you're doing here is building layers, and each secret that you add into your narrative is going to add weight by pulling the characters further down this rabbit hole of inevitable dread. Now, stage 4 is where the tone shifts. At this point, the protagonist is busy uncovering secrets and they're probably a tad bit scared, but now they become so invested in finding the truth that they're just downright obsessed with it. They need to find answers. They toss and turn at night because of it. They start wandering the halls at night, dreaming of what they shouldn't be dreaming of. Fear has now become fascination, and the line between reality and imagination has blurred into non-existence. Now, stage 5 is the confrontation with the antagonist and where the truth finally comes out. Maybe it's the tyrant at the top of the tower, the ghost that's been haunting the protagonist's dreams, the vampire that's been draining the bloodline dry for centuries, or the protagonist is just facing their own madness, guilt, or shadow. This is essentially the Gothic climax, but you'll notice that it's not the traditional battle that you're used to seeing. More often than not in Gothic narratives, the climax is the reckoning, a moment where the weight of the past, the sins of the family, other darkness of the desires come crashing down. And our last stage is stage 6, which is the ending. And now, Gothic horror rarely leaves its characters unscathed. The house might erupt in flames, taking everyone with it. The cursed line might finally end with the death of the antagonist. But regardless of how you choose to end your story, remember, there's always a cost. The protagonist might die, lose their sanity, or survive, but carry the scars of their stay forever. And even when the curse is broken, something always lingers. Ultimately, your goal here is inevitability. The ending should feel like it was always coming right from the moment your characters stepped through those castle doors, because fate is the truest villain of all. And that's the end of our journey into the dark halls of Gothic horror. If you enjoyed wandering through the crumbling castles with me, then don't forget to give this video a like. It helps spread the shadows of our lineage. Subscribe if you want more teachings from the crypt, and ring the bell so you don't miss the next time we unearth something chilling. Also, I'd love to hear in the comments about what your favorite Gothic novel, film, or character is, so leave them down there for me. So until next time, keep your candles burning, lock your doors tight, and don't fool yourself. Your past is waiting outside in the dark, and it's ready to come home.